Easter is on its way, and I'm really excited to bring you some easy Easter decorations that won't break the bank. Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name's Jess, and I love to make home decor on a budget. And if you do too, then let's get started. I love these new wood grained bunnies and eggs and chicks that they have at the Dollar Tree this year. So I knew I wanted to create a wall hanging out of the bunny one. I had this old sign from the summer last year, but you could use any kind of sign that has an arrow shape to it. And I'm going to use some of my favorite florals. The first thing I needed to do was separate the sign. I only needed one section for this. So whenever I find something like this at the Dollar Tree, it's always a great deal because usually that means I can get 3 DIYs out of one thing. Before I started painting the arrow part of the sign, I covered the design up with a piece of craft paper using a glue stick, and then I just took my sanding block and went downward over the edges to get rid of the excess craft paper. Next, I'm using the Truffle color by Waverly, and I gave the arrow one pretty thick coat of paint. I didn't feel the need to do two, especially because I knew I would distress the edges later on. The great thing about the bunny that I'm using is because the wood grain pattern on it is so pretty, I didn't have to paint that at all. I decided just to leave it alone. But if you wanted more of a distressed look on the bunny, you could go to town using some dry brushing on that too, and I think it would bring out the wood grain. Next, I took that sanding block again and I ran it over the edges just slightly. I didn't want too much of that particle board showing through, but I do like a little distressing, and I think the sanding block does a great job. I also created a decal using my Cricut that said Carrot Patch with an arrow pointing in the right direction, and I stuck that to my sign. Now, if you don't have a Cricut, of course you could use letter stickers, or if you're really great at hand lettering, you could do that too. I just don't really like my handwriting, so I always rely on my Cricut for these projects. To attach the sign to the bottom of my bunny, I'm just using some hot glue, and I did decide to hang my sign on my bunny crooked because I just think it looks really cute that way. It kind of gives the bunny a little more character. I'm sure you're like me and you have a lot of floral stems that look like this, where you used all of the flowers on a project but you have the stems and leaves left over. And this is a great way to use these up. So I clipped off one of the stems and I pulled off 2 leaves from another one of the stems and I attached it to the other end. I did add a dab of hot glue on each end just to make sure that those leaves wouldn't pop off, and I gave the stem a slight bend so that it would fit the natural curve of the bunny. And then I just topped it off with a few more pieces of greenery and a bow that I had created out of this shimmery pink ribbon. This is a great way to personalize things. If you're not so much into the farmhouse, you could definitely make it more simple and use something that's a little more modern or a little more boho, but you guys know me, I love my farmhouse, so I always try to stick with that theme when I do my projects. But because, like I said earlier, the wood grain on this bunny is just so pretty, it made this project come together so quickly because I really didn't have to do much otherwise. I just had to add a little paint to that sign and glue everything together. So I love projects like this. Give me a big thumbs up if you have one of those flowerless bunches of stems in your craft stash. I would really love it, and it would really help out my channel if you gave this video a big thumbs up, and make sure you're subscribed if you haven't already. And if you're on social media, I am on Instagram at GlueLaLa, so come follow me over there. I try to post fun things over there pretty often. I love all the different egg shapes and different sizes of eggs that you can find at the Dollar Tree this year, especially the wooden ones. And so I gathered up a few of the different ones that were different sizes, different thicknesses, and I decided to make a grouping of eggs. I did something similar to this back in Valentine's Day. I did a grouping of hearts that I really liked, and I thought I would try it again with the eggs. So again, they had that really pretty wood grain in an egg shape too, which made it great because that was one thing that I didn't have to do anything to. I decided to leave that egg alone. For the big egg and the little chunky wooden egg, I decided to give them a quick coat of the plaster color by Waverly. The big egg I gave one full coat. The little chunky egg I decided just to paint around the edges because I knew I was going to put something else in the center. I took a piece of floral scrapbook paper out of my stash, and that's what I decided to cover the small chunky wooden egg with. So I'm using my favorite paper glue. It's the Art Glitter Glue by Ranger. I usually have that linked in my description box. I gave it a light coat on the surface, rubbed it around with my finger, and then I stuck it to the scrapbook paper. And again, like I did with that arrow in the first project, I just used my sanding block to go downward over the edges to remove the excess paper. Now, because this isn't thin paper like the craft paper is, it's more like a lightweight cardstock. It did take a little bit more pressure to get the paper off, but it did come off fairly easy, and it gave it a really neat sort of tattered edge to it, which almost gave it a natural distressing. For the largest egg, I wanted to paint some buffalo check on this egg. I haven't done that for a while, and I always love doing it. I love how it turns out. And I know there's a million tutorials on YouTube on how to paint buffalo check, so I'll just run you through real quickly how I do mine. I always start in the center with my painter's tape because I think it just looks better if you start in the center rather than on one of the sides. And then I use another piece of painter's tape to act as a spacer, and I space out all of my tape going across the egg, and I have it laid out on its side here, but you can see that the stripes that I'm painting first will be vertical. To add a pop of color to this buffalo check, I decided to use this agave color by Waverly, which is one of my favorite colors to use in the springtime. So for the first set of stripes here, I mixed the agave color with the plaster color to lighten it up a bit. And what I like to do when I paint my stripes is I almost do a dry brushing on the stripes. I don't give them a solid coat, so that whenever I pull all of the tape off, it gives it a slight distressing. There's a lot of variations in the color. You can see here as I'm pulling off the tape how you can see the dry brush strokes through that paint, which I really like, but if that's not something that you like, you could definitely do more of a solid coat. So for the next step, after the paint has dried completely, you don't want to start adding the tape till all the paint's dry. I start in the center again, but going in the opposite direction, and I just repeat the process with the same color. I know a lot of times people like to switch colors, but when I paint buffalo check, for the first two sets of stripes, I like to use the same color. So once I had all of my horizontal stripes in place, I used that paint mixture again, and I did the dry brushing going the opposite direction. For the final step in painting buffalo check, all you have to do is replace the tape where it originally was going vertically. So you can see here, I left all of my horizontal pieces of tape in place, and because I did that dry brushing, it's a lot easier to see where those vertical stripes were originally. So I'm just replacing the tape again, and this time because I can see where I'm putting it, I don't need to use another piece of tape as a spacer. And if it's a little hard to see, if you're having a hard time seeing, just try to remember where you started. So for instance, I started in the center of this egg, so I could lay my piece of tape down in the center, and then I could still use another piece as a spacer if I need to. But because I dried brushed it, it was really easy for me to see where I needed to put the paint back, or the tape back on. So for the last step, I'm not mixing the agave with the plaster at all. I'm using it straight so that it's a darker shade of that teal color. And I did put it on a little heavier. I still would say it's kind of a dry brushing, but it's definitely heavier than what I did the first two times. After all the paint was dry again, now it's time for the final reveal, which is my favorite part. I love this so much. Every time I do it, I get so excited to see this buffalo check underneath. And I love this teal color. And I don't know if you can really tell here, or my hand's in the way, but I did rip off part of the egg, like the top of the egg kind of came off, and that's okay. I knew I'd be able to cover that up, but I love how that dry brushing looks in the buffalo check. So now it was time to assemble all of my eggs, and originally I was going to put the wood grain egg to the right side of this, but because that little section ripped up, I just had to switch it up and put it on the left hand side. And you can see after I glued it, I stood it up really quick just to make sure that the bottoms were lined up. And I'm just using hot glue here. I always use the Gorilla Glue sticks, and they have such a strong hold that I never really worry about things coming apart with those. And then I glued the little chunky wood kind of in the center, and I did the same thing where I stood it up just to make sure that all the bottoms of the eggs lined up. I felt like the top of that wood grain egg needed a little embellishment, so I created a double bow out of some burlap and lace ribbon that I had in my stash. I got this at Dollar Tree last year, but I've seen it in my store again recently, so they must be bringing it back. Then I topped the bow with a few sprigs of greenery and a few flowers. At this point, you could decide if you wanted to use this as a wall hanging. You could just create a jute cord hanger for on the back of it. But what I decided to do with mine, I wanted it to sort of stand up on this little table I have. So I decided to glue some tumbling tower blocks to the back side on the bottom, just so it could stand up on its own. I've been seeing creators on Pinterest and YouTube make these really cute bunny coasters out of nautical rope, and I wanted to try something like that but turn it into a garland. So a few things that I decided to use. I have this nautical rope that I got from Amazon. It's thinner than the one you could get at Dollar Tree, but you absolutely could use the stuff from Dollar Tree as well. And I had a few other items that I showed you, and some of them I'm going to use and some of them I'm not, because we all know sometimes you have an idea for something and it turns out, and then sometimes it doesn't. And I'll let you know what didn't work for me later on. I started by using some hot glue to fold the end of the rope over, and then I just started gluing and wrapping it in a spiral. And it really helps to have a silicone mat when you're doing something like this, because I noticed when I was working it was easier if I kind of ran the bead of hot glue towards the bottom side of the rope and then wrapped the rope around, and then that way all that excess glue that was sort of oozing out was oozing onto that silicone mat and it wouldn't stick. And then that way I knew that that would be the back side of my bunny, because you couldn't see any of the glue from the top surface. So I just kept gluing and wrapping and gluing and wrapping, and you have to use a lot of glue for this. You can't really skip any spaces. You have to make sure that you get it the whole way around, or else it's going to be a little flimsy and then there'll be some parts that kind of come apart. I did have a spool of ribbon nearby that I kind of used as my guide, because I wanted to create 3 of these bunnies and I wanted to make sure that they were all basically the same size. So it helps to have a circle nearby that you can compare the size to, just to make it more even with the other ones. The Dollar Tree does sell cute little white pom-poms that you could use as a bunny tail, but I didn't have any of those on hand, so I knew I needed to create my own. I took one of these small styrofoam balls and I cut one side off, probably about 1/4 of it, just to flatten out the end. I ran it along my sanding block just to smooth it out, and then I used my scissors to cut a little indent in the center. And you guys know, if you've been to my channel before, I love my car wash cloths from the Dollar Tree. So I cut a small piece of car wash cloth off and I just started wrapping it up around that styrofoam ball. And the reason I created that cavity in the center is so that I could tuck all the bulk from the cloth into that cavity. Just be really careful here, because I don't know what it is about this cloth, but every time I do it, I end up burning my fingers. And I know it's going to happen, and I still do it every time. So just be really careful when you're making your own. Or if you're lucky enough to have those pre-made bunny tails, you don't even have to go through this. Alright, so here's where things got a little weird. I had this big idea that I wanted to create the ears for the bunny out of some burlap. So I decided to take this brown felt first, and I kind of made a curve shape so that I could cut out some ears. I created patterns, and then when I laid it on the burlap, I just couldn't figure out how I would be able to glue everything together and not see any of the hot glue, because I knew it would seep right through that burlap. So I had to switch gears, and I wanted to show you guys this because not everything works out, and it's okay. It's crafts. You can always make it work somehow. So I decided to switch gears, and I decided to create the ears out of the same rope instead. Okay, back to the rope. I started by hot gluing a little bit on the end and folding it over so it formed a teardrop shape, which is basically the same shape as a bunny ear. And then this actually was super simple to do, way easier than the burlap idea I had. I just went around again, kind of like how I did when I created the bunny body, but I only had to go around one more time. I decided to leave the center of the ears open, which was a lot easier than wrapping and wrapping and wrapping, and it gave me a natural way to hang the bunnies from the garland once I was ready to assemble the whole thing together. Now my ears are done, so I can start putting my bunny together. I decided to glue the two ears together first, and I think they're so cute. I'm so glad how they turned out. And then I added a little more hot glue and added the bunny body to the top. And then the last step for the bunnies was just to glue the tail on his bottom. And like I said, I made 3 bunnies for my garland, but depending on how long you want your garland to be, you could make as many as you want. Normally I like to do wood bead garlands, but I have these really pretty pastel shimmery eggs in my stash. I think I got these on a heavy clearance sale after Easter one year from Michael's, and I thought they were foam, but they turned out to be more of a plastic, but they were still pretty easy to get this plastic needle through. I just have 2 lengths of jute strung through this needle. I'm not even sure where I got this needle or what it's actually for, but you can see here I was able to poke it through the eggs, and then I could weave it through the bunny ears, and then so on and so on. I did like 2 eggs and 3 eggs and a bunny ear, and I just kind of made up my own pattern, and when I needed to, I used my little paper piercer to poke a hole in the eggs just to get everything through. After I had my garland all assembled, I flipped it over and I went along the back side of the bunnies and I glued the jute into place on the ears because I was afraid it would slide around too much because the openings in the ears were pretty large. I knew it wouldn't slide on the eggs because of the material that they were made of, but I was not sure if the bunnies would stay in place properly, so I added a little glue to the back side of the bunnies. Thanks for hanging out in the craft room with me today. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this week's projects. I left some videos on the screen that I think you might like. Have a great week, and I'll talk to you in the next one.